You are now watching the Conversations on Sinology podcast, where China's past and present meet global curiosity. Join us as we explore Chinese language, literature, history, culture, economy, and ideas that have shaped one of the world's oldest traditions and play a powerful role in shaping today's world. Presented by the Montenegrin Sinology Development Council.
Welcome to Conversations on Sinology. Today we are joined by Dr. Benjamin Coles, who is originally from the UK but has lived in China for 20 years, and he is currently a lecturer in the Department of Philosophy and Social Development at Huaqiao University in Xiamen. He has a PhD in Chinese philosophy from the School of Philosophy at Renmin University of China, Beijing, an MA in Continental Philosophy from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Warwick, UK, and a BA in Philosophy from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Nottingham, UK. His research interests include Wei and Jin dark learning, preaching and Han Dynasty Taoism, Confucianism, comparative philosophy, modern European philosophy. He also translates both ancient and modern Chinese philosophy works into English and has recently completed a translation of Wen Haiming's modern Chinese interpretation of the Book of Changes. Dr. Coles, good morning, or should I better say good afternoon, as you are joining us from China. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon or good morning for you.
Yes, and first, your biography is quite impressive. So I'm just going to ask first a deceptively simple question, which is, what is philosophy? And in your view, does the term itself, rooted in the ancient Greek tradition, limit or distort how we engage with Chinese thought today?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my background was in Western philosophy in the UK, and then I came to China, and after I came to China, I started to kind of engage with Chinese philosophy, and eventually did my PhD in China, as you mentioned, in Chinese philosophy. So I think I have kind of experienced this kind of issue. It's my focus for someone like me who has a Western philosophy background, to then study Chinese philosophy. This is one of the key questions you have to kind of face and kind of deal with is when you're studying Chinese philosophy, how is it different from the Western philosophical tradition? And then our main focus today, I think, is going to be more about how, the issues about philosophy, that term being used with Chinese philosophy. So when I was studying in Renmin University, this was one of the issues that was quite popular at that time in China, which is kind of still fairly popular today, which is the question about what is Chinese philosophy and what makes it philosophy, or is it philosophy? Should we call it philosophy? And especially this question of, is it legitimate to talk about Chinese philosophy? So one of the main questions, of course, the background for this is the obvious fact, which hopefully everyone vaguely knows, that Chinese didn't have a word for philosophy in ancient China. So there was no term. If there was a term, we have no problem. But they didn't have a kind of concept of something that directly corresponds to philosophy in ancient China. So there are many terms, and people have talked about these. There are many terms for different aspects of philosophy that we would talk about. So people specialized in argument. There were terms for those kind of people, debating, or even kind of argument in a kind of formal sense, but there were often not very prominent terms in the Chinese tradition, something like bianzhe, which often is as like debater, but this term was used in the pre-Qin period, but it was not a very prominent term, and it didn't encompass all of the Chinese philosophers we speak of today, Lao Tzu and Confucius and Mencius. So they had other terms. They had obviously the figure of the sage, who I think we'll probably come back to later because it's very important in relation to philosophy, especially in relation to Western philosophy, which has had a concept of a sage at various periods, but now, if we talk about modern Western philosophy, the sage is basically pretty much an irrelevant concept. Nobody really talks about sage in modern Western philosophy. And then there was the concept of masters. So we all know that like Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, the Tzu on the end of their names is basically often translated as kind of masters, master of Zhuang or master Mencius. So they had these kind of terms. But then again, there was no clear differentiation between those subjects, or the masters, what they were talking about, and something like science or something like history or something like politics, something like economics. They were kind of masters just in a kind of all-round sense. And in modern philosophy, that's obviously something that philosophy doesn't really, it differentiates itself from other subjects. Of course, in ancient Western philosophy, that's less of a problem because, of course, they also didn't have the modern concept of psychology or economics or something like this. So there are all these kind of issues, and one of them that I think is the most important, the one that maybe I think is most important when we talk about research for Chinese philosophy would be ancient Chinese also didn't have a clear concept of religion. So they had religious traditions. We know about Buddhism and Taoism. Confucianism is more debatable whether it's religion or not, but they didn't have a kind of term that directly corresponds to that. Now, when we talk about philosophy, that's going to be a big problem because when we talk about tradition like Confucianism or Taoism or even Buddhism, we want to say that in Western terms there would be kind of religious thinking and then there would be kind of philosophical thinking, and they can be put together, but they might also be separated. And compounding that issue in China is the fact that Chinese kind of religions, especially the kind of orthodox religion of Confucianism, which encompassed political aspects as well. So to do with governance, to do with like order in the world. So not about religious truth or faith, but a case factor more about kind of how one should govern the state. And Western philosophy did deal with that, but that was not a core kind of function for Western philosophy. So all of these lead us to think about when we talk about Chinese philosophy, a problem with how we engage with it. And so, for example, an example might be if we think about religion philosophy question, people who study Chinese philosophy and read about it as called Chinese philosophy might think that, these Chinese philosophers, because they don't have a religious faith in a Western sense, they are doing something that's purely kind of immanent, or it's purely kind of concerned with this worldly kind of political terms, political concerns. But then the problem with that might be that Chinese philosophers did have references to a religious tradition. So Confucians did talk about heaven, and they talked about their kind of ancestors, and they talked about this tradition of sages. And all of these are kind of more closely connected to the Western religious aspects. But these aspects might be less prominent in, let's say, studies of Chinese philosophy because they are not really strong concerns of philosophy as distinguished from religion. So all of these might be issues that.
Thank you, and you thank you for that clarification. And you have just opened so many fields for discussion. And you are often pointing out that Chinese thought tends to be more immanent, pragmatic, and tied to governance rather than abstract logic or argument. Does this difference make it incompatible with the traditional Western model of philosophy, or is it just a different way, that, as you have already mentioned, of doing philosophy?
Yeah, I mean that the main problem then is about the term, the concept philosophy, and how kind of narrow or how broad it should be. And that's basically the root of all of these arguments is essentially we can say it's kind of a modern problem because modern philosophy has become something professionalized, right, and specialized in the West and also in China. If you're a philosopher, usually you will be in a university studying or teaching or researching philosophy, and if you're someone who's kind of just doing something in the government or in a non-academic situation, you maybe would not be regarded as a philosopher. So that issue is kind of leads us towards a kind of narrow idea of philosophy in modern Western philosophy. And so this has become the kind of problem about Chinese philosophy is on that narrow account, it has we can do Chinese philosophy. I mean, yeah, many people use, let's say, the kind of narrow professionalized language, vocabulary, and methods of, let's say, modern academic philosophy, and especially in, for example, America or UK, it's basically analytic philosophy where we're analyzing arguments and proofs and demonstrations using logical methods. We can do this for Chinese philosophy. The question is, what are we really doing Chinese philosophy in that case? We're kind of distorting it, as you mentioned earlier, by doing that. But the bigger issue is if we try to talk about Chinese philosophy in a kind of in itself, I mean, how would that compare with the Western idea? So is it compatible with the Western idea? And here there's a lot of problems. And I've already mentioned, I think, one of the main ones, which is philosophy has changed in Western history. And one of the best examples of this for somebody who's maybe knows about a little about Western philosophy would be there's a French scholar of Western philosophy, ancient philosophy, Pierre Hadot, Hadot, who died about, I think, about 20 years ago. But he studied ancient philosophy, and one of his main points that he made in studying ancient Western philosophy was that philosophy has kind of betrayed its origins in the West, especially in the sense that philosophy in the West was not a professionalized, specialized tradition in this narrow sense of kind of logical argument. So that's the kind of the narrow one that he's talking about in the modern sense is what we talk about when we say the handmaiden of theology, right? The philosophy just became the kind of because it had to go along with theology in the West, it became the kind of technical part of theology where we have to deal with proofs for God's existence or whatever, this kind of stuff. And so part of his argument is that if we go back to ancient philosophy, which he was a professor of Greek and Roman philosophy, then this was not the narrow idea of philosophy was not the main idea of philosophy. And philosophy had a kind of purpose of its own. And especially his main point is that philosophy was connected with ideas of something like cultivation, right? And this is something that Chinese philosophy is often regarded as really focusing on, because especially in the later tradition, influenced by Buddhism and Taoism, as we'll talk about, I think later, after the Wei Jin period, later Chinese philosophy often focused on this idea of cultivation. You know, in a similar way, you'd have kind of religious cultivation. And part of Hadot's argument is that in the West, this became kind of not part of philosophy. This was kind of remained part of the religious tradition. And philosophy just took the kind of logical part of that tradition and separated this out. Whereas in ancient philosophy, this separation didn't exist. They did logic, but they also had a view of that they had this kind of purpose for cultivating one's mind and one's spirit. And this is something that Chinese philosophy, I think, can help us with, is that you could say that Chinese philosophy is more continuous or compatible with the traditional ancient idea of Western philosophy and not less compatible with the modern tradition of, like I say, more humanistic philosophy, where philosophy had a kind of purpose above just proving the truth or something like this. So yeah, these are kind of questions I think Chinese philosophy, although it seems less, maybe not so compatible, traditionally in terms of Western philosophy, there's less of a problem with the compatibility of Chinese philosophy.
Thank you, Dr. Cole. You have pretty much elaborated why has the question of the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy remained so persistent in modern academic circles. And as we know, some argue that framing Chinese thought within philosophy imposes Western categories on it. Others say that not doing so relegates it into a non-philosophy status. So there is definitely a third way, and thank you for explaining this field to us. And as you have mentioned earlier, in the next part of the interview, we're going to talk a little bit about the Wei and Jin period, if you agree, Benjamin. You have researched the thought of the Wei Jin period, and it is a useful lens to discuss issues such as the relationship between Confucianism and Taoism, or between conformity and authority, and on the other hand, individuality and freedom in China. The development of distinctive Chinese literary class and the mentality, the allegedly modern division between philosophical and religious Taoism, and how Buddhism connected with the existing Chinese intellectual trends and became Chinese. So the next question would be, what makes the Wei and Jin period such a fertile ground for exploring questions of freedom, individuality, and authority in Chinese intellectual history?
Yeah, thanks. So the question is kind of connected to our earlier discussion about modernity. So one traditional idea about China, which most famously, I think I already mentioned, was proposed by Hegel, is that Chinese history developed up to a certain point and then kind of stopped developing. Usually, the traditional view would be maybe the Han Dynasty was this period. And this would correspond to kind of the flourishing of philosophy in China, or what we now call philosophy in China, in the pre-Qin period with the masters. And then the idea that Chinese philosophy then did not really develop so much after. So many earlier histories of Chinese philosophy would stop with the Han Dynasty because that would introduce you to Confucius, Mencius, Xunzi, Laozi, Zhuangzi, Mozi, Han Feizi, and all the famous Chinese philosophers. And after that period, I think no people would not. Maybe Wang Yangming is probably the most famous, I guess. I think some people seem to know him, but from the Ming Dynasty. But this view kind of would be contradicted, obviously, by this Wei Jin period. So the idea of philosophy connected to modernity is connected to this idea of kind of philosophy as critical of traditions and kind of reflecting on traditions rather than just continuing this kind of tradition. And so this idea that Chinese history stopped with the Han Dynasty would reflect this idea that maybe Confucianism became the kind of orthodox ideology of China in the Han Dynasty, and then after that it didn't really kind of develop or continue. And in the Wei Jin period, one of the key features of the kind of intellectual movement that regarded as kind of the core, maybe philosophical tradition of the Wei Jin period is the Xuanxue, or you mentioned the dark learning tradition, which is basically a kind of reflection on the Confucianism of the earlier period. And it's basically using Taoism as a way to answer the kind of question of what went wrong with Confucianism in the Han Dynasty. Why did Confucianism in the Han Dynasty, when it became the kind of orthodox ideology, why did it not kind of result in a successful society, but actually maybe society went into decline, and then eventually Han Dynasty, of course, collapsed. So the Wei Jin period is a kind of reflection on this tradition, and precisely because of this, it can be seen as more like philosophical. Thinking critically about the Confucian tradition was good, and what led it to go wrong in the Han Dynasty. And so they were reflecting on that from a Taoist perspective, and basically from really kind of fundamental issues, going back to like ontology or human nature and nature of language, nature of kind of human culture, all of these kind of questions. It's a kind of has, we can say, modern qualities in this period. And I should say there are other periods in China. One of the ones people often say would be the Ming Dynasty, especially the late Ming Dynasty after Wang Yangming. It's often regarded as a kind of proto-modernity in China. And the Wei Jin period has some similar qualities to this period because they are kind of reflecting on the traditions.
Thank you. So to what extent, you have mentioned the Confucianism and Taoism, to what extent can the Confucian and Taoist dialogue be compared to Western philosophical tension, so to say, between reason and intuition, or duty and autonomy, if it makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, we use these terms. Obviously, we're using Western concepts here. We mentioned freedom or individuality, authority. So some of these concepts do have kind of terms that kind of correspond to Western terms in some sense. So the idea of kind of self. So the idea of in Chinese would be 自然 as self-so, or also natural. And that was in the Wei Jin period, that became a kind of opposition to, we can say, falsity, something that's kind of false or kind of artificiality. And so this obviously can be compared to Western traditions because we have this kind of idea, like in philosophy, of people who are saying, something that's not true, or something that is kind of goes against the way things really are. So this obviously gives us this kind of idea, and this will be connected then in Chinese to the concept of freedom as something that's so of its own cause, not forced to be so by something else. So something that's kind of free to do, act as it would like to do, rather than being having something imposed upon it. And so this is kind of how they would try to reflect on the Han Dynasty in this kind of sense. Now the question would be how much do these correspond to Western terms? So something we mentioned, something like freedom. One of the issues would be in Western tradition, something like free will, or the idea of kind of natural, and in relation to free will. Often in Western tradition, of something being natural and something being so of free will would be kind of opposed, right? Because free will would be something that's kind of where you're using your rational kind of your higher nature and you're choosing something rather than being led by something or automatically. But in the Chinese tradition, they had more problematic relations between these. So one of in the dark learning, or the Xuanxue kind of debates, one of the main issues concern the kind of content of this idea of something being natural, and especially something like human qualities. So something you mentioned, something like intuition or something like feeling. These things that are kind of something that seems to be may go against the kind of idea of reason. These kind of things would be something that maybe would be not subjective things, essentially, would be something that goes against natural things. Natural thing is something that kind of natural process would be the model, where it doesn't have a kind of subjective purpose or a kind of a will or a kind of desire imposed upon it. And then one of the arguments at that time that's kind of prominent in some of the certain of these kind of texts, essentially, is between Confucianism and Taoism, but would be Confucianism tended to regard some kinds of feelings or sentiments as right, as essentially kind of correct, right? Especially maybe moral sentiments, right, with family or to do with kind of morality, right and wrong. Now, in Taoism, these were often regarded as kind of false impositions on nature. So they have this kind of argument about to what extent are certain human qualities, subjective qualities, to what extent are they natural and therefore right, right? And so this leads to this kind of this different understanding of arguments about kind of reason and feeling or emotion, for example. And duty and autonomy will have similar kind of debates, natural kind of rule, or are they kind of imposed by Confucian tradition, for example. So all of these kind of arguments connect to Western, can be compared to Western kind of argument concepts and debates, but they don't really correspond exactly in the same way. Basically, essentially, because of this difference about in the Weijian period, the kind of source of rightness or value was this idea of something being natural, essentially, or so something being developing in its own kind of natural way.
Thank you very much for that answer. And the Weijian period stands out as a transformative era in which scholars developed a deepened sense of cultural identity and intellectual self-awareness, making it a focal point of particular interest of many researchers, such as yourself. In fact, the Weijian era is often associated with the rise of the Chinese literati class. How did their role shape the development of a uniquely Chinese form of intellectual and cultural authority? Could we discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the Weijian thought is that we're talking about, the kind of philosophical tradition, was not did not exist in isolation. So it was connected, and in fact, many of the thinkers were not philosophers alone. They were also poets or musicians and artists in some cases, calligraphers. So they had this kind of wider cultural aspect, and all of this reflects this idea that kind of in the Han Dynasty, Chinese culture had a kind of more orthodox kind of conservative idea, and in the Weijian period represented a kind of liberation from Confucian kind of restrictions, and connected to then, as I mentioned, the idea of nature, natural in Taoism. If you feel that you want to kind of be an artist, then you can be an artist. Whereas in the Han Dynasty, there might be a question of what's the social function of an artist, and why should you be an artist? You should be we're serving in the governance or something. So this is why we say the Weijian period. If you look at histories of, let's say, Chinese aesthetics, Chinese literature, Chinese art, they often start with this Weijian period as a kind of when we start to get the idea of a kind of an artist or a kind of literary author in a much more obvious, kind of clear sense. So many of the earliest Chinese poets, after one or two early examples, but the Weijian period, there's a kind of explosion. You suddenly get all of these kind of Chinese poets and artists. And so this is part of this kind of idea. And so the question in philosophy then for someone like me would be, are there comparable changes in the Weijian philosophy that kind of correspond to this wider cultural movement of kind of liberation? And the American Chinese scholar Yu Yingshi called it a kind of discovery of the individual in this period. And essentially, one of the aspects is that because they were seeking for reflecting on the basis of Confucian ideas and using Taoism in this context to kind of provide a kind of a root or a kind of base foundation for Confucian ideas to explain why they work in certain contexts but don't work if they work in a more artificial way. Part of what this gave is a kind of more spiritual aspect for Confucianism. So you mentioned earlier that Chinese philosophy often has a more pragmatic focus. And so this was the most famous example would be, the sociologist Max Weber, his famous idea that China doesn't have or didn't have any kind of resistance to pragmatic things. It just, didn't have any kind of ideals or any kind of way. It was basically conformist, right? This was Max Weber's famous idea. And so part of what the Wei-Jin period gave is this kind of idea that there was a basis for Confucian ideas. And it was not simply a kind of idea of whatever works in governance is Confucianism, but rather an idea that some kinds of ways of governance are right, more right than others, and why this was explaining why this was so. And so this, we mentioned later Chinese history and the idea of this kind of literati class. This is one of the reasons why this kind of developed in the Wei-Jin period, is they started to have their own, we can say, their own kind of value position, more clearly. They were quite more self-consciously kind of aware of why they really had certain beliefs, they could discuss why something is right and wrong in this kind of context, more in less simply pragmatic way, but also in terms of some more fundamental kind of concepts about human nature. And so in later Chinese history, this kind of led indirectly via Buddhism, which is simultaneous to this movement, to the kind of rediscovery of Confucianism in the Tang and then the Song dynasty, where you had this literati class became a kind of really self-conscious class of kind of intellectual scholar officials, and the Neo-Confucianism that developed at that time, kind of the spiritual focus and the idea that Confucianism had a kind of philosophical, we can say, a kind of foundation. This was something that they kind of came indirectly via Buddhism from the Wei-Jin period, and their kind of attempt to kind of reflect on Han Dynasty Confucianism and what went wrong with it, essentially.
Thank you, Dr. Coles. This is so thoroughly and beautifully explained. And you have mentioned Buddhism. This was exactly what I wanted to ask next. How did early Chinese thinkers respond to the arrival of Buddhism? Did it find resonance, and was it influenced by existing Chinese intellectual traditions such as Taoism or Confucianism?
Yeah, so we already mentioned Buddhism a few times, but one of the main questions at this time that maybe people are interested in is to what extent did Buddhism have an influence on Chinese culture at this time? Because we already mentioned how the Wei-Jin period has certain kind of modern or philosophical aspects, and how early Buddhism started to have this kind of influence on Chinese culture might be relevant to this question. So, for example, one idea might be if Buddhism started to have an influence, maybe it's like 200 AD on this kind of elite literati classes and that kind of discussions, then that might be an explanation. You might say, if you were Chinese, you might want to say the philosophical aspects of the Wei-Jin that make it seem more modern are kind of somehow the result of Buddhism entering China and then kind of leading Chinese people away from the Confucian truth of the earlier tradition. So this will be a kind of question about the influence of Buddhism. The question your question may also asked about the other influence, which is the reception of Buddhism. So this more obviously we have more better records, let's say, of the influence of existing Chinese thought, Confucianism and Taoism, especially on Buddhism. So especially Taoism. So we mentioned the Wei-Jin period is essentially a kind of Taoist revival of maybe Taoism becoming more important in Chinese culture. And in the early reception of Buddhism, we see many of the Buddhist thinkers are essentially just using Taoism as a kind of lens to talk about Buddhism. And they begin to appear in this in the Wei-Jin period in relation to Taoist books. And so I think we didn't actually mention, especially one of the most important philosophical texts in the Wei-Jin period that was not so important before that would be the Zhuangzi. So Zhuangzi became a kind of key text for Chinese literati in this Wei-Jin period, and we know Zhuangzi has this kind of individualist kind of ideas and tendencies. So this is kind of key to the Wei-Jin mentality they were developing at this time. And so when Buddhism came in, this is how Buddhists kind of connected, was using Zhuangzi, using this kind of ideas to understand Buddhism, and they're trying to kind of this obviously had an effect on Buddhism. So one of the most kind of striking examples of this is the later developments of Buddhism in China. Usually people often say the most kind of Chinese form of Buddhism in the history of Buddhism in China would be the Chan Buddhism or Zen Buddhism. And this has famously been called kind of Taoism or Zhuangzi wearing Buddhist clothes. Essentially a huge influence from the Zhuangzi, and especially how the Zhuangzi was understood and interpreted in this Weijian period. So this will be one of the biggest influences, I think, on Buddhism is the Weijin Taoism, how it kind of affected ancient Buddhism, how Buddhism developed in China, especially.
Thank you very much for that explanation. And you have lived in China actually for 20 years, which is quite impressive. And you are the author of many translations and publications. And if we look at the translation as a facet of communication that extends beyond purely linguistic boundaries, what role did translation, not just linguistic, but conceptual, play in how Buddhism became Chinese? If you could explain a little bit, could this process teach us something about intercultural understanding today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there was the issue in that period of most Chinese people had no understanding of any other language other than Chinese. And interestingly, it's also been commented by modern scholars that Chinese people later, because they didn't have a kind of equivalent to ancient Greek or Latin in China, it would be ancient Chinese, but ancient Chinese is more continuous with how Chinese developed in the classical Chinese. So they didn't have another language they would be learning. But in the Weijin period, because of the introduction of Buddhism, language started to be a kind of focus of these thinkers, especially how to understand kind of concepts. So even just the Weijin tradition itself, based on Taoism, already was reflecting on language and how language kind of tricks us by confusing us in certain aspects. If we have certain concepts, they are kind of not necessarily corresponding to reality. So that was already a problem. And we mentioned the Han Dynasty, and this was part of the reflection on what happened to Confucianism in that period. So when Buddhism came in, there was already a focus on language, and that played well into how they received Buddhism. And so one of the best examples of this is in the early period, the way they were receiving Buddhism was essentially to find a Chinese concept and just use that Chinese concept to directly translate a Buddhist term, right? So they would take a term like nirvana and then directly try to find a term in Chinese that corresponded to this. Now, obviously, there was no term that directly corresponded to this, but they were using this kind of term. And this is why we start to see interesting kind of discussions in this period where Chinese didn't really have a very good grasp of what Buddhism was because they were essentially using Chinese terms. And the arguments about Buddhism often just simply reflected arguments that existed already between Confucianism and Taoism, for example. So in the early period, they were basically unable to really get into this kind of significant kind of debates about Buddhism because they were limited by the kind of availability of concepts. And one of the most important changes that happened around this time as the studies of Buddhism continued is Buddhist terms started to be introduced into Chinese with translations that kind of were essentially transliterations of the Sanskrit or the terms that were used in the Buddhist texts. And so essentially they had to learn foreign concepts and introduce them into their language in a kind of form where they could be used in Chinese because Chinese characters are written in ways where you cannot phonetically directly use the kind of like alphabetized transliteration of a term. So this kind of transition is kind of how they kind of gradually dealt with this. And there are fascinating kind of histories about the roles that which specific Buddhist monks took in this, Kumarajiva being the most famous one, how certain Buddhist monks kind of influenced this translation process. And you can see the kind of leaps forward in Buddhist understanding in China corresponded to new translations of texts, where suddenly this text made a lot more sense because it was being translated in a way where we were no longer confusing it with traditional Chinese concepts. So this was a kind of important aspect. And in the Weijin period, as I mentioned, this corresponded to this focus on language in general. So I think this is one thing we can compare to modern aspects. You talked about intercultural understanding. So if you talk about somebody like a modern philosopher, like, for example, Michel Foucault, one of the things that corresponds to this kind of modern and postmodern shift is in the West, with anthropology and these disciplines, studies of other cultures, there came to be a focus on kind of the contingency of conceptual schemes, where we kind of become aware that actually our language is not the only way of kind of carving up the world, and our traditions are not the only way of living. And so this was one thing that kind of corresponded to the modern rise, is this awareness of other cultures having different ways of understanding the world, even in a basic linguistic way. And this is basically what was happening in this Wei Jin period, where they were trying to understand Buddhism and trying to understand a kind of different way of understanding the world and seeing the world in this sense. And so this had a huge influence, of course, on later Chinese philosophy. We already mentioned the Neo-Confucianism, which was strongly influenced by Buddhism. And so then later in Chinese, we can say the next one largest example of this would be the modern period, where China began to kind of absorb Western concepts. And, this is so the Wei Jin period has a good kind of lens for this kind of translation. And especially, I think, finally, I should mention the fact that, you mentioned I do translations, and there are many kind of lessons for this period about how we should translate, understand Chinese terms, especially this idea of in the Wei Jin period, later Buddhist interpretations ending up having to introduce new terminology into their language in order to understand Buddhism. And in Chinese philosophy, essentially, this is something that has now become kind of quite widely accepted, is that you cannot really understand Chinese philosophy, especially certain of the key terms, without understanding these terms in a kind of native context, without understanding them. And there's no direct Western correspondence for a term like Dao, for example, or something like Ren in Confucianism. There is no term that can provide a satisfactory translation of these terms. So it's something they learned in the Wei Jin period as well.
That is absolutely interesting, and thank you for explaining the transition. And it is very important to understand, especially given the fact that translation is wrongly and most commonly understood as a process limited to the transfer between languages. So my next and final question would be, if you had to introduce a Western audience to one text or thinker from the Wei Jin period that could challenge their assumptions about what philosophy is, who would it or what would it be, and why?
Well, I think there's two aspects to this. One of them would be assumptions about what Chinese philosophy is. So if we're talking about Chinese philosophy, I think maybe one of the best people to introduce would be the poet philosopher Ji Kang. So Ji Kang was, I mentioned earlier, there are kind of often common views of Chinese philosophy as kind of traditional, or kind of we mentioned Max Weber's view of conformist, or not having a kind of logical argument, or not being concerned with this kind of debate in this argument in a Western sense. And so, as I mentioned, Ji Kang was a poet, and he also played the traditional guzheng, Chinese lyre instruments. But he was also a kind of someone who we can most very clearly identify as a kind of philosopher, because the way he was writing argumentative texts, writing refutations of other people's texts, where he would propose a kind of thesis and argue for it, and then somebody would write a criticism of his text, and he would write a refutation of the refutation. This is something we see usually in Western philosophy. We see this kind of argument, like dialectical argument, essentially, where thesis and antithesis. And Ji Kang was doing this with the concepts in ancient Chinese philosophy that he was debating. So for some people who maybe think of Chinese philosophy as not being concerned with this kind of argument, he would be a good thinker. And also, even in terms of just kind of his conceptual analyses, one text of his that we might want to look at is he wrote one of the earliest texts, we could say, in Chinese aesthetics of music. And he was trying to argue this question. The famous text is called Music Has Neither Grief Nor Joy. And essentially, he was arguing that music does not have an emotional content in itself, and that the emotional content is kind of applied to it, and that the same piece of music could evoke different and even contradictory emotions in people, depending on their own kind of subjective states. And so this kind of analysis, if you look at something like Western philosophy or aesthetics or music, would be, we have to look for at least 1,000 years later for something in early modern Western philosophy, where we start to get this kind of discussion of primary qualities, secondary qualities, or something about subjective states. And, it'd be much later kind of philosophy where we'd have this kind of argument. So he would be a good example to challenge people's views about what I think what Chinese philosophy would be.
So this recommendation of yours is very much appreciated and valued, and thank you for that. Dr. Coles, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your insights into the richness of Chinese thought, from its roots in Taoism and Confucianism to the fascinating transformations of the Wei Jing period. And you have helped us see not only how these traditions shaped Chinese intellectual history, but how they continue to challenge our assumptions and about what philosophy can be. Your reflection on translation, both linguistic and conceptual, remind us that intercultural dialogues is not just about finding equivalent words, but about opening new ways of thinking and living together. And for our listeners, I hope this conversations has offered a fresh perspective of the universality and diversity of philosophy and the importance of approaching different traditions on their own terms. Thank you again, Dr. Coles, and thank you to everyone turning in. Until next time.
Thank you.